absolutely overrun every single week, and it is just getting worse and worse with people in the most dire situations. Coming in tears, people with young kids, people with disabilities, elderly people and young people. All of the most vulnerable sectors of our society being driven, not just falling into homelessness, but being driven into homelessness as a direct result of government policy. So it's not an accident, it's not an oversight, it's not because the government is thinking about other things. What the government is doing is directly leading people into homelessness, and it is now reaching emergency proportions. And I am just sick of it now. We've been banging on about the government's failure to address this issue in the door for 2.5 years. 2 years ago, I brought, I think it was 10 families in who were facing homelessness into the gallery. I was addressing the Taoiseach. I pointed up to those families, I named them, and I said, these people are being made homeless because of what you're doing. Will you do something about it? And he said he would do something about it, and it was the government's priority to end homelessness by 2016. 2 years on, the situation is far worse than it was when I brought those people into the door. And everything the government have done since hasn't improved the situation, it has made it worse. Now you have to ask yourself the question, can they be that stupid that they don't understand what their policy is doing? And I've been thinking about this for the last 2 years, and I've now concluded they know exactly what they're doing. It's not a mistake, they're doing it deliberately. And you might ask, how could that be the case? How could a government deliberately want to make people homeless? Well, I'll tell you, I've worked it out. It's to do with the banks. Yes, again, it's to do with the banks. Let me explain. All of the banks have huge holes in their balance sheet because they are holding mortgages for property, the value of which collapsed after the collapse of the property bubble. So what does a bank do if it wants to stop itself going bankrupt because it has a huge hole in its asset balance sheet because of the mortgages? Well, the answer is you drive up rent and property prices. You do everything you possibly can to drive up rent and property prices, and to do that you need an artificial shortage of cheap housing, because their property is worth nothing if there's lots of social housing available, or if rents are low. So it is in the interests of the banks to drive up the price of property and to drive up rents. So we are bailing them out, this time not just for all the cuts that have been imposed on us, but as a direct consequence, making people homeless in order to restore the balance sheet of the banks and to incentivize big corporate American and European multinationals to come in and buy up all the cheap property and then jack up the rents. And that is what's going on. And the government are actively incentivizing it because, as we know, everything the government have done for the last 3 years has been to protect the banks, regardless of the consequences. But this is one of the most savage consequences, is that people are being made homeless. And they're being made homeless against a background where, incredibly, there are 350,000 empty houses in the state. But these are owned by the banks, and the banks have no interest in giving them to the people who need them. In fact, they would rather knock the houses down. And they are, incredibly, they're doing that. They're actually knocking the houses down, rather than put people who are homeless into them. So this is absolutely cold, deliberate policy to cause a housing crisis, to jack up the value of property and to jack up the value of rents, driven by the agenda of the banks. Now, wouldn't that make you sick? And just let me tell you of the human consequences of that. Over Christmas, this is just one of a multiplicity of examples I get. Over Christmas, there was a young boy, 19, who was suffering abuse and violence in his home. So he tried to get out of his house. But because they've cut social welfare from 200 to 100 for kids under 25, he obviously doesn't have enough money to be able to rent a place, even if he could get rent allowance. He was trying to do a back to education course, and he was that disqualified him because he was already in an educational course. It disqualified him from getting the back to education allowance, which would mean he would get the normal social welfare. So what happens to him? He ends up in a hostel in Benburg Street with people with chronic alcohol and drug problems all over Christmas and all over the New Year. And I raised his case with Joe Burton. I rang all the agencies. I said, here's a guy who's trying to get himself back into education. He's 19, he's suffering abuse, and you have him in a hostel in Benburg Street, just like Peter and so many others. Or Charlene, with 5 kids who go to school in Shankill, being put in a flippin' hotel out in City West, and not knowing from one night to the next will she even have that hotel room. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up, what they are doing. And we have to do something about it. We have to scream about it. And I'll tell you something else. The media would want to cop on to this. I mean, we had a meeting with RT, and in fairness, they acknowledged it. We said, why are you not talking about the housing crisis? And in fact, a senior person RT admitted it. He said, I know people who might have mortgage problems, but I don't know anybody on the council housing list. And that's the problem. The people who are making the news in Ireland do not know what it is like to be on a council housing list for 15 years. They are living literally in a different world. And so are the people in there. So how are we going to bring them into our world? We are going to have to shove it in their face, relentlessly. We are going to have to show this reality. I mean, if ever there was a time for chaining yourself to the railings of this building, it is now because of the housing crisis. But we need more people. And part of the problem we're also dealing with is people who are on the housing list or homeless are terrified. They're terrified if they kick up that they will be victimised by the local authorities and will never get a house. So we are living in a climate of fear and a climate where people are being driven into homelessness. And we have to do something about this. So I just want to appeal to people to help us build a campaign over the coming weeks. And that means finding people in your locality who are in this situation and trying to give them the confidence to come forward, to speak out, not to give in to the fear. And I want to assure people who are homeless or in housing difficulty, in fact, if you have the confidence to speak up, normally you shame them into actually dealing with you at least. Because I said the situation had got worse since Enda Kenny had those people put in front of him 2 years ago. But one interesting thing did happen to those 10 people. All of them got phone calls within a week from the Department of Social Protection saying we might be able to sort you out. They don't want to change the policy, but they're desperate to get the embarrassment of what their policies are doing to people off the news agenda. So in fact, it is the opposite. There is nothing to fear. The more you speak out, the more we will force them to confront the issue, and it will actually help the individuals involved. And we need to get that message out to those 100,000 families who are on the housing list, that they have to come together, they have to speak out, and the more they do it, the more they will actually get this government to shift its policy. So I really hope the people here will commit themselves to building that campaign on this most serious of issues, because it doesn't get any more serious than having a roof over your head. You don't have a roof over your head, you simply cannot function in society. That's the reality. So we have to fight for this most basic right, and indeed demand that it is a legally enshrined right that people have the right to proper, permanent, secure and affordable housing. And the last thing I want to say is this. Later today, I'm going to be confronting the Taoiseach, because they're having their 3rd anniversary of the government in office today. They're going to be crowing about how much wonderful things they've done for the country. Any of the people who are directly affected should come into the door later this afternoon. And tomorrow I have questions down to Joe Burton on the issue of the rent caps and how they're contributing. The more I can get people who are directly involved, have them sitting in the gallery and be able to point up and say, these are the human beings that you are making homeless as a result of your policy, the more we can start to shame them into doing the right thing. So that's an appeal to get people in tomorrow morning. It's early, I'm afraid, 9:30. so that we can confront Joan Burton about what she's doing. So I hope people will fight this. It's sickening and something has to be done.
Well done, Ricky.